On the 29th of February 2020, the Trump administration signed a deal with the Taliban which would bring an end to nearly 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Among other things, the agreement states that Afghanistan would never again be a base for terrorist activities against the US or its allies. Constant strategy change led the US to believe there was no military solution, but their agreement with the Taliban, a former government who harboured terrorists such as Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, has been controversial. Some worry that President Joe Biden, who pursued Trump's deal, is resigned to the Taliban retaking control.
But then don't you bear some responsibility for the outcome if the Taliban ends up back in control and women end up losing the rights?
No, I don't. Look, are you telling me that we should go into China go to war with China because what they're doing to the Uyghurs, 1 million Uyghurs out in the West in concentration camps? Is that what you're saying to me?
Regardless of whether or not they will continue to harbour terrorists, the US withdrawal gives the Taliban ample opportunity to topple Afghanistan's weak government and security forces. Nonetheless, the US is scheduled to have withdrawn all of their troops by the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks which started the war, and this video will explain why Biden reached this decision. The first reason for this is the war's unpopularity. While there was a poll by NBC and the Wall Street Journal which suggested that about half of Americans disagreed with President Trump's withdrawal plan, there were also polls which suggested in 2011 up to 62% of Americans thought the war was a bad idea, and obviously the war has only continued for 10 years after that. Unpopularity has driven a lot of US policy. According to the New York Times, when President Obama inherited the war from his predecessor, he saw the war as unwinnable in the long term but called for a troop surge which was intended to enable a negotiated withdrawal from a position of strength. So basically the idea was to train up the Afghan security forces so that they could take on the Taliban themselves and essentially leave Afghanistan on a high and not after, the sort of endless quagmire that they saw in wars like Vietnam. And when President Trump came to power, he declared his own tactical change.
We are a partner and a friend, but we will not dictate to the Afghan people how to live or how to govern their own complex society. We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists.
As I said before, Donald Trump would eventually conclude that there was no military solution in Afghanistan, but for a while it kind of looked like there would be. As you'll know from watching my other video in Afghanistan, within the first 2 months the Americans had actually deposed the Taliban government, and of course in 2011 they assassinated Osama bin Laden. So it wasn't really the military things that went wrong. What went wrong was the nation building exercises after the fact, which intended to replace the Taliban, who they deposed. The Bush administration created a new democratic government in Kabul led by Hamid Karzai and then by Ashraf Ghani. This government is very corruption prone. In the most recent elections, President Ghani's rival Abdullah claimed voter fraud and had himself sworn in simultaneously in an unofficial ceremony. The US needed to broker a power-sharing agreement between the two sides, and this corruption, along with the physical and cultural distance between the rural and urban areas of Afghanistan, has given the government a complete lack of legitimacy, and this takes me to my second point, which is that a war is completely unwinnable. See, even though the Taliban were kicked out of government, they continue to live on the fringes of Afghanistan where the US couldn't easily reach them, and in these areas where they're living, they pretty much seem to be winning the war of ideas as well. In Isaac Kafir's 2009 essay, apologies if I'm butchering that, but in this essay he says it is abundantly clear that despite billions of dollars and massive international efforts, many Afghans do not feel connected to their state. If anything, Afghans increasingly see a presence of the international community as an occupying force keeping a corrupt and decadent government in power. On the other hand, in the words of an Afghan man, they, as in the Taliban, collect 10% of tax on all income, even from the government field, so if you grow 100 kilograms of wheat, you pay 10 kilograms and they give you a receipt and they never charge extra or more. In a weird way, this has given the Taliban a legitimacy that they just didn't actually have when they were actually in government before the war. In another part of the essay, they write about the propaganda campaign which the Taliban uses to double down on this, saying that there's a full-page pamphlet showing a young girl being searched by US forces. This is the ultimate insult for conservative Muslims who severely restrict the movement of women and girls and their interactions with men. In some parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, touching a woman other than a relative can be enough to get a person stoned to death. Attempts to connect these communities have been largely unsuccessful. For example, Vox reports that a ring road designed by the Americans to do just this ended up costing about $5 million per mile because the Taliban just kept attacking it. The US doesn't even really have total legitimacy in the places like Kabul, where the views on women are more liberal and their preferred government is in power, and this is because there's quite a few military exercises which have ended with the deaths of civilians, such as a really famous one on a wedding party which President Karzai had a few choice words to say about at the time. The US also finds it impossible to cut the Taliban's funding, a lot of which comes from taxing opium. According to The Guardian, opium production went from 180 tons in 2001 to 8,000 tons in 2007. One reason that it's so prevalent is because of decades of war. Afghan farmers began to turn to opium in desperation since it produced high profits that could cover rising food prices. A suggested reason for why the Taliban fell so quickly in 2001 is that they tried to outlaw opium, leaving these same farmers going hungry and getting angry. So the US is in a weird catch-22. If they keep the opium, they're funding the Taliban, but if they destroy it, they make the same people who they're trying to convince about the government in Kabul a lot angrier. President Biden has said that his decision is at least partially motivated by the need to engage China in strategic competition, but this is sort of a double-edged sword because the US currently only has about 3,000 troops in Afghanistan out of 330,000 odd troops in the American army, so really they've got a very small commitment at the moment. As well as this, China has a lot of interest in the Taliban, and when the group comes back to power, they're going to have Chinese backing. However, at the same time, this is a country which is known as the graveyard of empires for a reason. The Americans have already sunk in trillions of dollars, and a previous superpower, the Soviet Union, practically bankrupted themselves trying to do the same, fighting against the Mujahideen insurgents for 10 years in the 1980s. Now, of course, you could argue the Mujahideen had international backing, but really, the Taliban has their own international backers as well, and it doesn't look like that's going away anytime soon, nor does it look like the US would actually win in a war. Regardless, Joe Biden is pushing it ahead with his decision, and the clear consequence of this is that the Taliban is going to retake control. On the day of me writing this, there was a DW video which showed the Taliban were already surrounding provincial capitals in Afghanistan and preparing for a siege, and of course the consequences of the Taliban coming back to power is the rolling back of the little civil rights that have been put into Afghanistan in the post-Taliban days. For example, in an issue of The Economist, they reported that even though the Taliban claim to no longer oppose girls going to school, girls do not seem to be allowed to remain in education past puberty in rural areas controlled by the Taliban. As well, despite the treaty rules, there are worries that the Taliban are not going to uphold their end of the deal and not use Afghanistan as a base for terrorist attacks against the US. Now, there is an argument that the West needn't worry about this. For example, in The Economist, they wrote that the Taliban have contradictory goals. What they clearly want is to be the dominant force in a new government, but they also want the international aid on which Afghanistan survives. Now, countries which give aid to Afghanistan include America, which obviously isn't going to accept any terrorist attacks against itself, and Saudi Arabia, which is an ally of America. However, at the same time, the Taliban have managed to fund themselves basically just on road taxes, agriculture taxes, opium taxes, and things like that. Now, whether they can run a government like that or not is yet to be seen, but at the same time, they didn't worry about international aid when they were in power before. There's an argument they might not do it again. There's also the worry that the US will have to get re-involved at a greater cost. For example, in 2011, when they withdrew from Iraq, they had to go back in to fight ISIS. In a Vox interview with the academic Lisa Curtis, she said it's not always a win-lose situation. We're trying to manage threats, and we can manage the threat from Afghanistan by empowering and working with our Afghan partners. Her argument is basically that on the outside, the US is powerless, whereas on the inside, we can continue to train Afghan security forces in the hope that it would stop the Taliban from coming to power. But what do you think? Were the Trump and Biden administrations right to withdraw from Afghanistan, or should they have stuck around for a little bit longer? Let me know in the comments below, and as well as that, make sure you check out my other video on Afghanistan, which should be out about the same time, I would say, and also my column on We Are Righteous, as well as just doing the decent thing and subscribing to my YouTube channel, because you've made it to the end of this video, so this stuff is clearly your cup of tea. If you like my Joe Biden impression, you should subscribe to this channel.